Great. Good evening. Today we will go over overcoming barriers to rational decision making. But before I do that, I'd like to ask you about how you go about making decisions and any hurdles that you may encounter to decision making. Um, and how precisely do you overcome those hurdles? So, this is what I would say usually happens with people. If someone asks an ordinary person how they make decisions, they're likely to say, I just come up with it, or I wing it. Or if they are more specific, they will say, I use a rule of thumb. Or if they are more organized, they will say, I use a decision matrix with weights, like I do sometimes. Uh, and if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to explain how I do that. Um, now, in academia, scholars call these rules of thumb, heuristics, strategies that simplify the process of making decisions. When we use heuristics or rules of thumb, um, we tend to have our rational decision making influenced by biases right here, right? Cognitive biases and logical fallacies. So we have a rule of thumb, and usually it goes through a filter of biases and logical fallacies, right? Or it goes through um, our minds goes through various filters, simplifications, and calculations, right? Now, biases have to do with our education, our experience in life, and the limits of our information, our insight, our wisdom, and understanding. And there are a host of biases that we go through or suffer from, or may not suffer from. Till we come to a decision, right? For example, suppose you have a rule of thumb saying something. I've picked a rather facetious example, something like, "Oh, I won't date people who eat steak with forks," right? Basically, these are steaks that are like super. There are steaks in the world that are like super soft, and you don't need a steak knife for that, and you can actually like use a fork, apparently. Such steaks apparently exist in the world, and some people eat it. But suppose somebody does not like steaks that are so soft. Basically, if they have such a rule of thumb and it goes through their filters of biases and fallacies, they may decide that they have a bias for very attractive people, right? And because they have that bias, they might be willing to forego and overlook this rule of thumb. And they may say, oh, well, I will make an exception for this very pretty person because I have a bias for attractive people who have great personalities. So I will just overlook this like minor little um, rule of thumb that I have, right? Or heuristic that I have for dating people. Now, there are a host of logical fallacies. I won't be going through the logical fallacies, but I will be going through some of the biases, right? And just like there are fallacies, there are cognitive biases, and your textbook lists a list of lists a host of cognitive biases, which I will not go over in the lecture, but you may look into them since they're useful in making better decisions. And the textbook is, of course, credited and referred to in the concluding slide. In the following slide, we will list the biases that are listed in the book. And again, I will not go over these in too much detail, but instead I will attempt to outline, just the um, rudimentary elements of the biases, right? So first of all, I will go through these quickly, these 10 biases. Availability bias has to do with what is available in your memory. Usually, whatever your memory pulls up, it might be accurate, it might be inaccurate. So whatever's available, it might affect your decision making and bias it, right? Then representativeness bias, it has to do with how our mind, our minds basically generalize and make simplifications in order to make quick decisions, and that can result in a bias that might end up in inaccurate results, right? Then next is a confirmation bias, right? So a confirmation bias usually arises when people tend to surround themselves with other people who can confirm their ideas and who have the same ideas and the same background and similar inclinations. It creates like an echo chamber and it or a bubble, and it allows them to reinforce their biases, right? So for those people, such a people, they would be likely to suffer from a confirmation bias and even end up looking for information that would support their point of view, right? Then the next one is the sunk cost bias. The sunk cost bias has to do with when people look at their past activity and they say that, oh, well, I've already spent a lot of money on this particular project or this particular endeavor, and it is too costly to simply abandon it. So even if it'll cost me more money, for the sake of the money that is already sunk, I will be biased in favor of continuing this course of action or this particular project. And even this kind of a bias can arise even when you have information that tells you that a change in your course of action would be preferable and that you should abandon that project or abandon that particular line of thinking, right? The next one is the anchoring or adjustment bias. It has to do with where you are anchored or where you start, right? And it is the tendency to make decisions, sometimes inaccurately, based on where you are anchored, where you start your evaluation or analysis, and where you begin your evaluation sometimes can incorrectly influence your estimate, right? Then the next one is the overconfidence bias. It has to do with um, your subjective confidence and how that influences your decision making and prevents you from making a decision objectively and accurately, right? The next bias is the hindsight bias, which is basically it's a feeling when you look at an outcome and you go, oh, you know what? I should have known this all along. Oh, I knew this would happen. And then you beat yourself up over it. Unfortunately, some people do, right? Not necessarily you, but then basically this kind of a bias can be sometimes countered in the lay world with when people say things like say things to console you by saying, "Oh, don't worry, you didn't really know this was going to happen. Hindsight is always 2020." Those kind of phrases or cliches are often used in real life to alert people that they might be suffering from hindsight bias, where a person is convinced that they predicted the event before its occurrence. The next bias that people suffer from is the framing bias. It is the tendency of decision makers to be influenced by the way a situation or problem is presented to them. Now, people tend to favor a decision if the choice is framed positively to them, and they tend to oppose a decision if the problem or the choice is negatively framed or couched in negative terms, right? Um, so that is the framing bias. The next bias is the escalation of commitment bias. It's sort of like the sunk cost bias, and it occurs when decision makers increase their commitment to a project despite negative information about it, right? Confirmation bias, also known as the escalation of commitment bias, describes your tendency to remain committed to a past behavior, particularly those exhibited publicly, even if they do not have desirable outcomes, right? The next bias has to do with the categorical thinking bias. It is the tendency of people or decision makers to classify people or information based on observed or inferred characteristics. If you have ever been accused of generalizing or profiling people, it is usually because you have engaged in a bias called the categorical thinking bias. Now, I will go into more details regarding each and every bias, right? The first one is the availability bias, right? It has to do with what information your memory pulls up. Whatever is more generally available, you tend to um, uh, you know, um, have biases in favor of that. So an example would be if you start reading in the news, a lot of news item about the thigh gap, which is basically slender people who have a gap right below their belt, between their thighs, and it's supposed to be a mark of beauty. And it might, if you're surrounded by that information overload or that particular media, you might develop a bias, and you might think, well, everybody has a thigh gap, right? Even though it might be just a few people from Europe or Eastern Europe or like Scandinavia or Russia who enjoy such anatomical advantages. Or for example, if you watch a Jaws movie and you become terrified of swimming in the waters for maybe a few weeks or a few months, or in some cases with some people it lasts, unfortunately it lasts longer than a few months, and they can be traumatized long term. It's because their memory has basically begun to associate the oceans with the presence of danger and with sharks and the fish that might harm them. So it may be said that the phobias are related to the availability bias, right? Again, it's basically a mental shortcut to rapidly determine the risk involved in um, the particular task. However, relying on it can lead us to make poor judgments or estimations. The next one is the representativeness bias. It's basically misgeneralizing from a small sample. We tend to make conclusions based on just looking at an incident or looking at a small group of people. An example would be if you see a person in a suit, you might conclude, oh, they might be lawyers or bankers or some other white collar profession. And basically, another example is that analysts can end up forecasting optimistic results for a company based on historical performance. Now, that might just be because a company, just because a company has performed well in the past doesn't mean that they'll have the same growth in the future, right? But that is due to a representativeness bias, or your tendency to basically use the present or the past as representative of the future, right? Now, the next bias is the confirmation bias. You develop the confirmation bias when you avoid opposing points of views or cognitive dissonance, and you gravitate towards similar point of views or cognitive consonance. For example, you have an idea for a product that you think might be successful. You decide to do some research and find that if the product will be successful, you just try to find to do research to find out if the product will be successful, and if it is, then you try and And if you have a bias towards that, towards the notion that your product will be successful, you tend to accept data that supports your position and discount data that opposes your point of view. The way to combat such confirmation bias is to often have counter arguments, or what the Roman Catholic Church uses, which is playing the devil's advocate, or some other major institutions use basically counter arguments to basically find out the viability or feasibility of a decision or a thesis. The next bias is the sunk cost bias. We've already gone through a little bit about it. This has to do with when you look at your past and you see, oh, I've already spent so much energy and so much money and so many resources on this project. I don't want to abandon it. When you really should abandon that project, you tend to develop a bias if you have spent a lot of energy, a lot of resources on a project. You tend to develop a sunk cost bias in favor of that project, right? So hopefully, this should be obvious, but you can read the slides or the PDF that goes into an example. The next bias is the anchoring or adjustment bias. It has to do with, wherever you're anchored, wherever you begin with. Suppose that a car, a certain car, like I don't know, a Tesla costs $10,000, and you approach a car dealership and they tell you that the Tesla is actually selling for $20,000. Now, you immediately recoil and you say, well, I'm not really interested. And to this, the dealership might say, well, listen, you seem like a good person, and we're really happy today with all our sales. So let's give you a discount and we'll sell it to you for $12,000, right? So we're giving you an unheard of incredible discount of $8,000. That's what the dealership might say, right? So if you are ignorant of the inherent cost or the intrinsic cost of the car, of the Tesla, you might be swayed. You might be like, oh my God, these people are, they're giving me an $8,000 discount. This is a great deal. Well, this is not a great deal because you're suffering from an anchoring or adjustment bias. Basically, you're anchored to the $20,000 initial amount that they gave you, and you're being influenced by that initial figure. That is what an adjustment or anchoring bias is. Um, However, if you knew the price of the Tesla, the inherent value of the car, which you suppose you know it to be 10,000, you will see that the price of $12,000, even after coming down from $20,000, is still too high. Like $12,000 is still $2,000 too high, right? And if you had bought the car, you would have fallen victim to the anchoring or adjustment bias. The next bias is the overconfidence bias. And it has to do with when people's confidence in their decision making is greater than their objective accuracy. For example, most investors think they are above average in beating the average analyst returns. Now, that is like a mathematical impossibility because an average is, after all, an average, and most people are not only ever overestimate their own abilities, they also overestimate their character. As a result, they take ethics lightly, and they think that they're in the top 10% of ethical people, so they don't pay attention to moral improvement or moral reasoning, and they're not on guard, and they lower their guard, and it is said that they're suffering from an overconfidence bias. An example in the business world may have to do with the construction of the Sydney Opera House. The initial estimate was 4 years of construction and $7 million Australian. And the Opera House was ultimately built in 14 years, and they ended up spending $102 million, which is, like an astronomical amount compared to their initial estimate, right? So the next bias is the hindsight bias, which is the "I knew it all along" effect. Now, this bias is usually it's suffered by people who feel like somehow they could have predicted the outcome. they might run into an event and they feel like, oh, this was so predictable, I should have known, things like that, right? This bias can actually hinder your learning because you feel you ought to have already known the negative outcome or whatever outcome, and you do not really end up investigating the real causes behind the outcome. So the remedy to this is to be autonomous and to try to manage your impressions that you make upon others, and then you're likely to be less susceptible to the hindsight bias, right? Now, the next bias is the framing bias, which is how someone frames a problem. It's found that if you approach a person and you tell that investor, for example, and you ask them, this particular person who is an investor, that please invest in my project, and the chances of successfully doubling your investment within the year are 50%, right? If you say that to an investor, they're more likely to invest in your project if you frame it in a positive way by saying, "Oh, you're likely to double your investment in within the year, and the chances of that happening are 50%," which is really like 50-50, which is like, with any project. But if you frame your pitch in a positive way, they develop a framing bias, right? But if you make the error of framing your pitch in a negative way, and you say, well, the chances of losing your investment is 50%, um, and the investor is likely to have a negative bias and avoid the investment, right? The remedy is that to reframe your questions, to avoid the framing bias, right? To frame them in different ways and reframe your questions, and then you can avoid this particular bias in your decision making, right? Um, the next particular bias is the escalation of commitment bias. This occurs when decision makers increase their commitment to a project despite negative information about it, and despite all factors pointing to the undesirability of the project. Right now, imagine you're wrapping up your first year of university, right? And you're majoring in STEM, for example, like a science, technology, engineering, mathematics majors, right? And and then you end up enrolling in a business class or a management class, or in a law school class or an acting class, and you really enjoy that class, and you really want to switch your major, right? But you start thinking, well, everybody expects me to graduate as an engineer or become an engineer, and basically I have spent so much money on this particular major and this education. You could say that you would be suffering from an escalation of commitment bias, because at this point you might escalate your commitment to your engineering major and decide to not go with what you truly enjoy. Um, this feeling that our future behaviors must align with the things we have said and done in the past, they compromise our ability to make good decisions. And this is especially true when our initial decision has led to unfavorable outcomes, right? Furthermore, it can be problematic when our past behaviors do not align with our current values, right? So our values might change over the over the course of um, our lives, right? And the escalation of commitment bias can sometimes keep us trapped in unfeasible or incorrect decisions, right? And the way to avoid this commitment bias isn't always that easy, but for one thing, it involves going against our natural drive for consistency. For another, it can make us worry that others will think poorly of us for making just flaky decisions or being haphazard or completely random. And the first step to avoiding commitment bias is recognizing that consistency isn't the be all and end all. And when our decisions have negative consequences, it seems like the obvious course of action would be to try something else instead. Yet these undesirable outcomes often serve to make us more resolute in our initial choice, right? Um, an example of the commitment bias is the sunk cost bias, which we've already gone over earlier, right? Now, the categorical thinking bias, so it has to do with our tendency to make decisions or classify people or information based on observed or inferred traits, right? Basically, if you have ever been accused of generalizing or profiling or using stereotypes, it probably may have something to do with you're suffering from a categorical thinking bias. And now we need categorical thinking. Everybody engages in it, and we need generalizations and profiling and stereotypes in order to make quick decisions and in order to basically get through life. But sometimes it can end up in inaccurate estimates and inaccurate decisions. So the thing is, you have to remember that your categories and your generalizations, first, they must be valid. And, you know, that means that you can't just arbitrarily divide something without any point, but the categories must be valid categories. As Plato said, that carve nature at its joints, etc. Now, the second thing is your categories must be useful. So they must serve some kind of a function, some useful function in order for you to embrace that particular category. Otherwise, it's likely you might suffer from a categorical bias. And you can read more in the PDF slide, whose link is in the description. So in conclusion, we all suffer from biases and engage in fallacies. It's best to be just aware of them and avoid them and try to make better decisions. Thank you for listening, and I hope this was useful. Essentially, these particular lectures are to help students who have a need to review material which we could not cover in class. Thank you.